ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm George Binns, and I'm here with my co-host, Gail Burke. And we're having a discussion this evening with Sergeant Dave Costa, and he is the supervisor of the Community Impact Unit. So to start this off, what is a Community Impact Unit? What does it do?
Well, our main goal is to kind of address like quality of life issues within the city. A lot of times with patrol, they're going from call to call, and they can only spend so much time on different calls, but some calls require a little bit more attention. So our kind of job is to kind of get at the root of whatever the problem is and address these quality of life issues, and whether it's getting people connected to treatment or offering some other kind of support. That's kind of our role. That community outreach role is what we do for the city.
How big a unit is this?
There's myself, one other officer, and a mental health clinician from Leahy. So
the mental health is not a city employee. It's some feet.
She's a clinician from Leahy's Behavioral Health who's assigned to work directly with us full time.
Oh, that's neat. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I don't live in Beverly anymore, but I lived there for a number of years. And I was quite concerned when Beverly declared racism as a public health issue. I have to say that during all my years there, I never experienced or observed any kind of racism. And when they declared it to be a public health issue, I was rather concerned and confused. Can you explain it to me a little bit? To the audience?
Well, I think racism exists everywhere. I think we don't always see it. But I think a lot of the Black community has, experienced it more than we know. I can say the same thing. I really don't see a lot within the city, but again, a lot of stuff doesn't get reported to us. And a lot of people have their own experiences that maybe we don't always see, but it doesn't mean they don't exist. They're definitely happening, and people are dealing with some different issues.
Well, there's been some documented evidence that depending upon your ethnic background, you are susceptible to different diseases. The classic case is the sickle cell anemia. And anybody that has an ethnic background from around the Mediterranean, especially, where there is a lot of malaria, some people developed a modification to their blood system to make them a little less susceptible to malaria. But the problem comes in if you had two parents that have got this genetic difference, then you are susceptible to sickle cell anemia. So that's one of them. The other one they keep talking about is people in the low rent district live in a very tough environment, and they are susceptible to a lot of stress because they don't know what's going to happen next. Some of the stress is caused by the local natives running the area. Used to call this the protection racket. And some of it is caused with the concern over interactions with the police. And really, I think this is where a lot of the problem comes in, and that police tend to, well, the reaction with the police tends to be a very tense situation. You got stopped for some sort of violation, and it can get worse from there. So I guess I'm putting words in your mouth, but I think this is where the community impact group comes in to solve problems without getting an escalation in the situation.
Well, I think that's it. I think there's a lot of people out there that think that all the police, the only function that police have is to arrest people, and That's not the case. I mean, we can get in and we don't arrest everybody. We try to solve problems without arresting people a lot of times. And you're right. Some of the different neighborhoods get some more calls than others, and it's some of those dense neighborhoods where people are kind of living in closer proximity to each other and kind of on top of each other, and you're going to get more calls for service because people are going to hear the noise complaints, or people going to have their own little disputes with each other and things like that. So we're going to get called down. But our job or our goal is not to arrest everybody. Our goal is to try to solve the problem without that, without having to arrest people, and just kind of restore the peace. And that's kind of where the community impact unit comes in. That sometimes there's a root of the problem, and a lot of things that we deal with, like, we'll go to the same house over and over, and it's mental, it's a noise complaint, it's whatever it is, but the background is the person has a mental illness. Maybe that contributes to it. So if we can get in with our clinician and get that person connected to services, or if they're already connected to services, kind of work with those services, we can solve the problem that way. And it keeps that person out of jail, a person who doesn't need to be there. And it solves the problem for the neighborhood as well, because we're not going to that call over and over anymore.
I have a lot of empathy for the police, because I think that the job you do is, as you said, not just arresting people, but you must have to have some experience or background in psychology, and I think a lot of that is probably covered in your training. But when I see people, particularly minority people, talking about the talk they have with their children, I'm always annoyed, because I think, the talk that you have with your children should be respect the police. They're there to do a job. Yeah, there may be instances where, an officer might step over the line, but think of what they're dealing with every single day. And when you stop somebody in a car, you don't know what you're going to run into. Or when you're called for, I know domestic violence is probably, from what I've heard, one of the worst things that you can encounter, because you knock on a door, you break a door down, you don't know what you're going to find inside. So I think that that should be included in the school curriculum, is to respect the police, respect adults. And I think a lot of that is missing.
Well, I think, unfortunately, I think the media kind of drives a lot of the stuff. I think you see a lot of negative stuff on the media, and not just with police, with everything, with everybody. And I think sometimes it kind of gives the impression that, there's a lot of bad people out there, a lot of bad police officers, a lot of bad, people in general. And the world's a much nicer place than I think it's portrayed, in the media sometimes. And, it's important to have talks with your kids and prepare them for things they're going to deal with, and try to, I don't know if you want to say, just protect them in a way so that they're not blindsided by what goes on. But certainly, we want people to understand that we're here to help. We're not here to be these bad guys. We're not here to arrest everybody. We try to send the message that we're here to help, and we want people to be able to feel comfortable calling us when they need help.
How do you feel when you see all these newspaper articles and you see people in your own community crying and screaming about defunding the police? To me, that's a horror show.
Well, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of misinformation about how we police. There's a lot of people saying that we need more social workers to go to calls instead of us. Well, we have, we don't necessarily have social workers on staff, but we have our clinician that we work with. We have a domestic violence advocate who's a civilian, who's essentially a social worker for the domestic violence cases, and we partner with a lot of social service agencies. We work with a couple an outreach program in Lynn for substance abuse, an outreach program in Gloucester for substance abuse. We work with different social. Elliott is one of the agencies that's kind of like does a lot of the mental health stuff in this area. So we work with all those social workers, and that stuff is kind of already in place. But I think one of the things that we have to work on as police is kind of letting people know what we do. A lot of people don't know that we do this stuff, and I think we need to kind of get the word out a little bit more so that, like I said, there's a lot of misinformation about how we train, about how we do our job. And I think that the only way to combat that is to kind of get out there and explain to people what we do and why we do some of the things that we do.
Is there any effort to put more police patrolling the streets on foot and getting to know the neighbors and the neighborhoods?
There is.
I think
so
that's a good way to go.
Yeah, again, that's part of my job, and part of the Community Impact Unit. We get out there and we'll get out into the neighborhoods here and there. We do it a little bit more in the summer. So I also have the school resource officers as part of my unit. So during the school year, they're in the schools and they're kind of doing their thing over there. But in the summer, they come and work out of my office. And so we'll get out, like this past summer, they were getting out into the neighborhoods, talking with kids, handing out stickers and things like that. So we kind of do some of that stuff as well. And, the chief's always asking for more officers, but, there's only so much money. The city has a limited budget, and, we do the best we can, but we will always take as many officers as we can get. The more we can get, the more we can do. And that's what we try to be.
Well, I think one of the things that precipitated this show was that there was a meeting on Zoom with the Human Rights Committee, and you made a 5-minute presentation on your changing role, which gets into hate crimes and other kinds of issues. And I think you started to explain that you're in the learning phase of trying to figure out, what does this all mean? So could you do a little bit longer presentation for us on exactly what has changed and how does that impact your function?
Yeah, so I guess we're kind of learning some new things here, where people from the Black community are expressing their concerns and some of the things that they've experienced that, again, you kind of touched on it earlier, where we didn't think, or people didn't think that, racism was a big issue in Beverly. But again, we don't know what it's like to be Black and what it's like to experience that and the different interactions that people have had in the community. And so we're learning a lot of that. It's a lot of learning what the Black community is dealing with and what they're experiencing. And basically what we're doing with the Human Rights Committee is kind of say, like, try to follow the same model that we do with mental illness or substance use. In those cases, we follow up with, people, we follow up with people who have had overdoses, and we try to tell them, hey, we're here to support you, and we want to connect you to services, when you're ready. Same thing with mental illness. Hey, we're here to support you. We want to help you so that you, stay out of trouble. And this is kind of a similar type of a thing. We want to make sure that people who are victims of racism or any other kind of bias-motivated incident have some support, so we can go out to those victims. We've already been investigating hate crimes, and that situation is, or that that procedure is already in place. But now we're kind of trying to set up a situation where we can go to those victims afterwards and say, hey, we're here to support you. Here's some people from the community who are also here to support you. And what can we do to make this better? What can we do to solve, the issue that you're facing?
I think
so that's what we're kind of working with.
You raised a couple of issues in there. One was you mentioned about how you work with people who are addicted. And the point you made was that the media doesn't necessarily emphasize all the good stuff that the police department does. And I think the change in attitude in the media from it bleeds, it leads to now, if it's outrageous, we'll publish it kind of approach ignores the fact that you guys are carrying Narcan for the simple reason that you stumble across somebody who is OD'd and you're the first responders to try to get them out of it and bring them back. And this was making a lot of headway for a while, and then it just disappeared from the paper. Nobody talks about the addiction rate anymore, and yet the work continues to go on. And I think that this issue of hate crime was something that you brought up at that meeting. What is a hate crime? And I think you were starting to parse it down to, well, first of all, it's got to be a crime. So what kind of crimes can possibly turn into hate crimes?
Well, generally, I think you see a lot of either violence, like assaults, or you see intimidation, things like that as intimidation, harassment, things like that is usually what we typically see. But it could be graffiti. We've investigated incidents where the temple on Lothrop Street was vandalized with spray paint. So you have things like that too. But typically, I think we generally think of it as something violent or something assaultive or intimidating, things like that.
A lot of the issues that show up in the paper on the police blog is somebody was yelling in the street or yelling in an apartment or banging on the walls kind of thing. Do these possibly end up with a disturbing the peace charge, or what's the difference between just being obnoxious and disturbing the peace, I guess is what it comes down to?
Well, I think, again, I think you see some of those. Those are some of the kind of trivial crimes, I think, that, you'll see a lot of mental health. People with mental illness have kind of a lot of times creating those kind of disturbances. And that's where, again, arresting them for something small like that is not really the best option. It's not going to solve the problem. Might solve the problem for that night, but that's why we try to get in there and instead of arresting people, try to connect that person to some kind of service. And generally disturbing the peace is not something we. Every situation is different, but disturbing the peace is not something we just go in and just arrest right away. Generally, if you're arrested for disturbing the peace, it's because we've gone there over and over. We've given you a couple of chances to try to quiet down, and we're not able to solve it, and that's when the arrest comes in for something like that. But again, that's something we try to avoid, and that's something that a lot of times, again, can be solved with connecting people to services, getting some different services in place, and getting people support in the community.
I wonder about this new director of civil rights and the money that the taxpayers are putting out to hire somebody, to hire a person that is in charge of this. And frankly, in the city of Beverly, I can't see the dire need for it. I think given all the violence that we saw this past summer and into the fall in different cities, I think the money might be spent better on, adding police officers, giving more training, that sort of thing. I was very concerned when there were a couple of marches in Beverly, which did not turn violent, but could very well have. people carrying the American flag upside down, just things that incite violence in people. Racism, sometimes I think it's in the eye of the beholder, because a lot of times people are misinterpreted by what is being said. And I read a lot of what goes on in the country, and I see if somebody is losing an argument, the first thing that comes to mind is you're a racist. I know the president has been called a racist, and many, many times, which I don't believe is true. But how do you deal with something like that?
Well, I think it's number one, I think it's important for us to make sure that we're providing the services that we need for the citizens. I mean, there's always to have somebody come in and kind of just make sure we're doing the things the way we're supposed to be doing them is not a bad thing. To make sure that we're doing what we should be doing on our end, and investigating crimes properly and then treating people properly and things properly. Excuse me, things like that. I don't think that's a bad thing. To kind of just make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. But you're kind of raising the issue. Everything is subjective. I mean, it's not just when it comes to racism. It's with everything. There's a lot of people who kind of misinterpret what other people say. Again, outside of racism, sometimes it's just people disagreeing, and they kind of take it as, well, you hate me because you disagree with me, and that's not always the case. But it's subjective. It's
become an excuse today, I think, to call people racist, and that's a pretty damning charge to put on somebody.
Well, it's kind of like that fine line. I think there's some cases like that, but there are also some cases where, racism exists. I don't think anybody's denying that racism exists, and we want to make sure that some of these cases where people are being harassed because of their race or because of their religion or whatever, we want to make sure that everybody is supported and every crime is investigated and things like that.
I think one of the things that people don't want to recognize is, number one, there is no such thing as race in our species. So really what you're talking about is ethnic background. And just about every ethnic group that has immigrated into this country has ended up in the low rent district and had a very tough life until they worked their way out. And one of the things I got a kick out of was doing a show with a minister from the Zionist Church in Lynn, and he was talking about interactions with the police, and he just casually dropped, "Oh yeah, and they bring the paddy wagon out and take us away." I'm second generation Irish, and paddy wagon is technically an ethnic slur to the Irish. And yet it really reflects the fact that there was a time when most of the police interest was focused on Irish neighborhoods. And then somebody else moved into the low rent district, and they still got to be a tough neighborhood. And the police were still attracted to the things going on there. So this has been an ongoing situation that it doesn't go away by itself, and it really becomes more, I think, of an economic issue rather than a personal one. And making it a personal one is just a scapegoat to the real problem.
Yeah.
Well, I think like I said, there are some legitimate issues that that people raise. I mean, there's some of the things that I'm learning and learning about, like redlining and things like that, where people in the Black community were either denied loans or given higher interest rates, and made it a little bit harder to buy houses and kind of move up. That some of that stuff legitimately exists, and it's crazy to think that happens in our country, but some of that stuff does happen. And I think, different locations around the country are worse than others. But again, we have to kind of, our goal is to make sure that everybody feels supported and try to look at everything with an open mind and understand where people are coming from and try to put ourselves in their shoes and see what they're dealing with and try to look at it from their perspective so that we can support them better.
Well, I
Well,
think
as you
that,
probably
I'm sorry.
haven't noticed, we've just about used up our 30 minutes, and Kim will get very excited with me if I don't keep the show under. And one of the things I think that necessary you're implying is we need to talk to each other more often and discuss things. And there is an activity going on with the Beverly Public Library. They got a Zoom meetings that they're having, and they're having one on the 18th that they call a living room conversation. And it's raising the question of post-election, what's next? And I think this is part of the overall solutions of the problem of get everybody talking about all the things that are concerning to them. And maybe instead of just yelling and screaming, we can have a decent conversation. And
Well, that's what we try to do.
yeah, so Gail, what do you think we should close this with?
Well, I want to thank Dave for coming on the show. We appreciate it. We always appreciate it when we have either police officers or, members of the community and elected officials on the show, because they can provide insights that maybe don't always make the papers. But we want to thank the viewers for watching. We will be back again, and we hope that you enjoy the show and we can provide enough information so that you become better informed citizens. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.